when our prehistoric ancestors met their modern descendants. Security, remove this woman immediately. She's clearly disturbed and doesn't belong at my event. I have every right to be here, Victoria. I'm your grandmother, and it's time you learned the truth. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Victoria Wright-Sterling stood frozen in her champagne-colored Dior gown at the entrance of the Metropolitan Arts Center, staring at the elderly woman in a threadbare coat who had just spoken her name. The woman's silver hair was tangled, her face weathered by years of hardship, but her eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes, held a clarity and determination that made Victoria's heart skip a beat. Around them, guests in tuxedos and evening gowns paused their conversations, sensing drama. The security guards hesitated, looking to Victoria for direction. This was supposed to be the triumph of the evening, Victoria's annual charity gala for homeless veterans, the society event of the season, with 500 of Chicago's elite gathered to celebrate her philanthropy. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare. "My grandmother is dead," Victoria said coldly, though her voice wavered slightly. "She died 30 years ago. Someone escort this confused woman to a shelter." "I'm very much alive, dear," the old woman said softly, "and I can prove it. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor Wright stepped off the Greyhound bus at Chicago's Union Station, carrying everything she owned in a battered canvas bag. She had traveled for 2 days from Seattle, living on stale vending machine sandwiches and coffee, rehearsing in her mind what she would say when she finally came face to face with the family she hadn't seen in 3 decades. Eleanor was 78 years old. Her hands trembled slightly from arthritis and her back ached from sleeping on bus station benches. But her mind was sharp and her purpose was clear. She had spent 30 years believing her silence protected her family. Now she knew the truth had to come out no matter the cost. As she walked through Union Station, Eleanor noticed how much Chicago had changed since 1993. The station had been renovated, filled with new shops and gleaming marble. Young people moved past her, absorbed in small, glowing devices she'd learned were called smartphones. She felt like a ghost from another era, invisible to the rushing crowds. She found a public restroom and did her best to clean up. She washed her face and hands, tried to smooth her hair. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The last time she'd been in Chicago, she'd been a middle-aged woman with carefully styled hair and pearl earrings, married to a successful businessman, living in a beautiful home in Oak Park. Now she looked like what she was, a homeless senior citizen, one of the invisible people society pretended not to see. Eleanor left the station and began the long walk toward the address she'd memorized from the newspaper article. Her granddaughter Victoria was hosting a charity gala tonight at the Metropolitan Arts Center. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Victoria raised money for the homeless while having no idea her own grandmother lived on the streets. As Eleanor walked through the city, memories flooded back. She remembered Chicago in the 1960s, when she and her late husband Henry had first moved here. They'd been so young, so full of hope. Henry had started his accounting firm and they'd bought their first house. Their son Thomas had been born in 1965, the same year the Voting Rights Act passed. She remembered watching Walter Cronkite announce Kennedy's assassination, crying in her kitchen. She remembered the moon landing in 1969, staying up late with 4-year-old Thomas to watch Neil Armstrong's first steps. Those had been good years, simple years, years before everything fell apart. The walk to the Arts Center took Eleanor over an hour. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, but she kept moving. She couldn't afford the bus fare, and anyway, she needed the time to prepare herself for what came next. She arrived at the Metropolitan Arts Center just as the sun was setting. The building was a magnificent Beaux Arts structure from 1904 with marble columns and bronze doors. A red carpet led to the entrance, flanked by velvet ropes. Luxury cars were pulling up Mercedes, Jaguars, even a Rolls-Royce depositing elegantly dressed couples. Eleanor watched from across the street for several minutes. She saw her granddaughter Victoria arrive in a silver Tesla, photographers snapping her picture as she posed with her husband Robert. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the resemblance. Victoria had the same high cheekbones as Eleanor's mother, the same graceful way of moving. She was beautiful and poised, every inch the society woman. Eleanor's chest tightened with emotion. This was her granddaughter whom she'd last seen as a little girl of 8. Victoria had been such a sweet child, always drawing pictures, always asking questions. Now she was 42 years old, married, wealthy, influential, and she had no idea Eleanor was alive. Eleanor took a deep breath and crossed the street. She approached the entrance, walking past the expensive cars, past the well-dressed couples, past the photographers. A security guard immediately stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is a private event," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "I'm going to have to ask you to move along." "I need to speak with Victoria Wright-Sterling," Eleanor said. "It's urgent. It's about her family." The guard's expression hardened slightly. "This isn't the time or place. If you need assistance, there are shelters." "I don't need a shelter," Eleanor interrupted. "I need to speak with my granddaughter." The guard spoke into his radio. Within moments, another security person arrived, and then another. They formed a semicircle around Eleanor, gently but insistently trying to move her away from the entrance. That's when Victoria herself noticed the commotion. Victoria walked over, her heels clicking on the marble steps. She looked annoyed, then concerned. "What's going on here?" "This woman says she needs to speak with you, Mrs. Sterling," one of the guards explained. "We've asked her to leave, but..." Victoria looked at Eleanor for the first time, really looked at her. For a moment, something flickered in Victoria's eyes, confusion, perhaps recognition. But then her expression closed off. "Security, remove this woman immediately. She's clearly disturbed and doesn't belong at my event," Victoria said, her voice carrying authority. And that's when Eleanor spoke the words that would change everything. "I have every right to be here, Victoria. I'm your grandmother, and it's time you learned the truth." If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Now, in the present moment, Victoria stared at the old woman, her mind racing. Her grandmother Eleanor had died in 1993, or at least that's what she'd been told her entire adult life. There had been a funeral, a closed casket, her father weeping inconsolably. Victoria had been 12 years old, confused and heartbroken, unable to understand why Grandma Eleanor was gone. "This is absurd," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My father identified the body. We buried her in Oak Park Cemetery." "Your father lied to you," Eleanor said simply. "Or rather, he told you what he believed was necessary. But I didn't die that day, Victoria. I walked away, and I've been alive all these years." Victoria felt the world tilting. Around them, guests were gathering, drawn by the drama. She saw her husband Robert approaching, concern on his face. She needed to handle this quickly before the woman ruined her entire evening. "I don't know who you are or what you want," Victoria said, "but my grandmother is dead, and you need to leave before I call the police." Eleanor reached into her canvas bag with trembling hands. She pulled out a small, water-stained photograph and held it up. Even in the fading light, Victoria could see what it showed, a young woman in a 1960s dress holding a baby, standing in front of a house Victoria recognized. It was her father's childhood home in Oak Park. "That's me holding your father in 1965, Eleanor said. "I have other things too. Your father's first baby tooth, which I saved in a little box. A letter your grandfather Henry wrote me from Korea in 1952. Your father's report card from 3rd grade. Things only Eleanor Wright would have." Victoria's hand shook as she took the photograph. She looked at the young woman in the picture, then at the elderly, homeless woman in front of her. The resemblance was there, buried under years of hardship, but unmistakable. "This proves nothing," Victoria said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Old photographs can be stolen." "I have a birthmark," Eleanor said. "On my left shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon. Your father would remember it. I used to tell him it was where an angel kissed me. I have a small scar on my right knee from when I fell off my bicycle in 1954, and I know things about your family that no one else could possibly know." Robert had reached Victoria's side now. "Darling, what's happening? Who is this woman?" "She claims to be my grandmother," Victoria said numbly. Robert looked at Eleanor with concern. "Mrs. Sterling, perhaps we should take this inside, away from the guests." "There's even a chance." "There's no chance," Victoria said sharply, but she was wavering. "My grandmother died 30 years ago." "Then let her prove she's not who she says she is," Robert suggested gently. "Let her speak to your father. If she's lying, he'll know immediately, but if there's any possibility she's telling the truth." Victoria closed her eyes. The evening was already ruined. Her perfect gala, the event she'd spent months planning, was now a spectacle. Cameras were out, phones were recording. By tomorrow morning, this would be all over social media and the news. "Fine," she said coldly, "but not here. Robert, take her to the service entrance. Keep her away from the guests. I'll call my father." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Thank you, Victoria. I know this is hard. I know you don't believe me yet, but your father will recognize me, and then you'll understand why I had to come." Robert gently took Eleanor's arm and guided her away from the main entrance. Victoria watched them go, her heart pounding. Then she turned to the guests, forced a bright smile, and said, "Just a small misunderstanding, everyone. Please go inside. The cocktail reception is beginning." But her hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone to call her father. Thomas Wright was 72 years old, retired from his law practice, living quietly in Evanston with his wife of 40 years. When his phone rang at 7:30 p.m., he was reading the newspaper in his study, as was his habit. "Dad, I need you to come to the Arts Center immediately," Victoria said without preamble. "There's a woman here claiming to be Grandma Eleanor." The phone fell from Thomas's hand and clattered on the floor. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The words seemed impossible, yet some part of him had been waiting for this call for 30 years. Dad, are you there?" Thomas picked up the phone with trembling hands. "I'm coming," he said hoarsely. "Don't let her leave. I'll be there in 20 minutes." He hung up and sat motionless for a moment, his mind reeling. His wife Barbara appeared in the doorway. "Thomas, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he said quietly. "My mother is alive. She's at Victoria's gala." Barbara's face went pale. "That's impossible. Your mother died in 1993. We buried her." "We buried someone," Thomas said, standing up. "But it wasn't her. I always knew she was alive. I helped her disappear, and now she's come back." 20 minutes later, Thomas walked through the service entrance of the Metropolitan Arts Center, his heart hammering in his chest. Robert met him and led him to a small office where Eleanor waited, sitting in a folding chair, looking small and fragile under the fluorescent lights. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other. 30 years dissolved in an instant. Thomas saw his mother's face, older, weathered, but unmistakably hers. And Eleanor saw her son, now an old man himself, with white hair and deep lines around his eyes. "Hello, Tommy," Eleanor said softly, using the childhood name only she had called him. Thomas's face crumpled, tears streamed down his cheeks. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his mother into his arms, holding her as he had when he was a small boy and she had been his whole world. "Mom," he sobbed. "Oh God, Mom, I thought you were safe. I thought you were living somewhere peaceful. What happened?" "Why are you here? Why are you?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The word homeless stuck in his throat. "It's a long story," Eleanor said, crying too, holding her son. "And it's time everyone heard it, including Victoria." Victoria stood in the doorway, watching the reunion. Seeing her father, her strong, composed father, weeping like a child, she knew the truth. This was her grandmother. The woman she'd mourned for 30 years had been alive all this time. "Dad," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "What's going on?" "Why did you tell me she was dead?" Thomas pulled away from Eleanor and wiped his eyes. He looked at his daughter and she saw shame and sorrow in his face. "Because I thought it was the only way to keep her safe," he said, "and because she asked me to." Eleanor stood up slowly. "Victoria, your father isn't to blame. The decision was mine, and now I need to tell you why. I need to tell you everything." They moved to a larger room, a conference space the Arts Center staff provided. Victoria dismissed the gala, putting her assistant in charge, no longer caring about the event that had seemed so important an hour ago. Robert brought coffee. Victoria's stepmother Barbara arrived, looking stunned. They all sat around a table, 4 generations of a family brought together by truth that could no longer stay buried. Eleanor began her story. "I met your grandfather Henry in 1951, she said, looking at Victoria. "I was 18 years old, working as a secretary in downtown Chicago. He was 20, just back from Korea, trying to start his life again after the war. We fell in love quickly. We got married in 1952, and your father was born in 1965. Thomas held his mother's hand, encouraging her to continue. "Henry was a good man," Eleanor said. "Kind, hardworking, honest. We had a good life together. He started his accounting firm. We bought our house. We had dreams. But Henry had demons from the war, what they called shell shock back then, what you'd call PTSD now. He had nightmares, terrible mood swings. Most of the time he was fine, but sometimes." Eleanor paused, her voice catching. "Sometimes he wasn't himself. He'd drink too much and his temper would come out. He never hurt Tommy, never, but he hurt me, not often, but enough. I made excuses for him. I told myself it was the war, that he couldn't help it, that I just needed to be more careful not to upset him." Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes. She'd heard stories about her grandfather Henry, who died of a heart attack in 1987. Everyone had always said he was wonderful, a pillar of the community, a loving father. "The violence got worse in the 1980s, Eleanor continued. "Henry's business was struggling, he was stressed, and he was drinking more. In 1990, he hit me so hard I ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw. I told the doctors I'd fallen down the stairs." Thomas squeezed his mother's hand. "I didn't know," he said. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" "You were starting your own family," Eleanor said. "You had a new baby, Victoria. I didn't want to burden you, and I was ashamed. This was my husband, your father. How could I tell you he was hurting me?" Eleanor took a sip of coffee, gathering her strength. "In 1992, Henry found out I'd started putting money aside, planning to leave him. He became enraged. He said if I tried to leave, he'd kill me. And I believed him. I'd seen that look in his eyes before. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the heating system. Outside, the muted sounds of the gala continued, but here time seemed suspended. In January 1993, Henry came home drunk one night, Eleanor said, her voice growing softer. He started yelling, accusing me of planning to leave him to ruin his reputation. He grabbed his old service revolver from the war. He kept it in a drawer in his study. He pointed it at me and said he was going to kill me and then himself. He said if he couldn't have me, no one would. Victoria gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. I ran, Eleanor said. I managed to get out of the house and ran to the neighbors. They called the police. But by the time the police arrived, Henry had locked himself in his study. They talked to him for hours. Finally, he agreed to come out if he could speak to me alone. Eleanor's voice was trembling now, reliving that terrible night. The police let him talk to me with officers right there. He was calmer then, crying, apologizing. He said he'd get help, that he'd never hurt me again. But I looked in his eyes, and I knew if I stayed, one day he would kill me. Maybe not that day, maybe not that year, but eventually. What happened next? Victoria asked quietly. I told the police I wanted him arrested. They said they could arrest him for assault, but he'd probably just get probation, maybe mandatory counseling. Illinois laws weren't strong then for domestic violence, and I knew that arresting him would only make him angrier. Eleanor looked at Thomas. That's when your father got involved. I called him the next morning. He came immediately. And we made a plan. Thomas took up the story. Mom had some money saved up, about $5,000. I added another $10,000. We opened a bank account in a different name. Eleanor used her middle name, Rose, and her maiden name, Patterson. I found her a small apartment in Seattle, far away from Chicago. Henry died of a heart attack 5 days later, Eleanor said. His heart couldn't take the stress, the alcohol, everything. When he died, Tommy called me in Seattle. And we made a decision. We decided to let everyone think Mom had died, Thomas said. There was a woman who died in a car accident that same week, someone with no family, unclaimed at the morgue. The funeral director was someone I knew from law school. He helped us arrange a closed casket funeral. We buried that woman under my mother's name. Victoria stared at her father in disbelief. You faked Grandma's death. You lied to everyone, to me, to Mom, to the whole family. Your mother knew, Thomas said. Barbara knew. We told her the truth years later, but yes, we lied to you, to your uncles, to everyone else, because Mom asked us to. But why? Victoria demanded. Grandpa was dead, you were free, why did you have to disappear? Eleanor's eyes were sad. Because I was ashamed, Victoria. I was a battered wife, and back then that was something shameful. People would have pitied me or blamed me or said I should have left sooner. Your grandfather was respected in the community. If people found out what he'd done, what kind of man he really was, it would have destroyed his reputation. And it would have hurt your father's law practice. People would have wondered why Tommy didn't stop it. So you sacrificed yourself to protect his reputation, Victoria said, anger creeping into her voice. The man who tried to kill you? I sacrificed myself to protect my son, Eleanor corrected gently. Your father had worked so hard to build his career. He was a young lawyer with a growing family. I didn't want his father's violence to taint his life. And honestly, Victoria, I needed to start over. I needed to be somewhere where no one knew me as Henry's wife, Henry's victim. In Seattle, I could be just Eleanor, just myself. But what happened? Victoria asked, looking at her grandmother's worn clothes, her weathered face. How did you end up like this? Eleanor smiled sadly. Life happened. For a few years, everything was fine. I got a job as a bookkeeper. I lived quietly. Your father sent me money every month, but then I got sick, cancer. I beat it, but the medical bills destroyed my savings. This was before the Affordable Care Act, and my insurance had lifetime limits. I burned through everything. Why didn't you ask me for help? Thomas said, anguish in his voice. Mom, I would have helped you. I know, Eleanor said, but you'd already done so much. You'd given me a new life. And then your law firm had that scandal in 2008, remember? That partner who embezzled money. You lost so much, I couldn't burden you with my problems. Thomas put his head in his hands. Mom, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I worked as long as I could, Eleanor continued. But when I turned 70, my health started failing. Arthritis made it hard to type. My eyes weren't good enough for detailed work. I lost my job, and then my apartment. For the last 5 years, I've been homeless. The word hung heavy in the air. I've lived in shelters, on the streets, in my car until it broke down and I couldn't afford to fix it, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. I've eaten at soup kitchens. I've slept under bridges. I've been one of those invisible people you walk past without seeing. Victoria was crying openly now. Grandma, I organize charity events for the homeless. I raise hundreds of thousands of dollars. If I'd known you were one of them. You couldn't have known, Eleanor said. I made sure of that. I changed my name, remember? I was Rose Patterson in Seattle, not Eleanor Wright. Your father sent money to that account for years until I told him I'd moved and would contact him with a new address. I never did. I couldn't bear for him to know what had become of me. But you came back, Robert said quietly, speaking for the first time. After all these years, after protecting your son's reputation, after keeping this secret, why reveal yourself now? Eleanor's expression changed, becoming more determined. Because 3 weeks ago, I was in a public library in Seattle, using their computers. I was searching for information about Chicago homeless shelters, thinking maybe I should come back here where at least I knew the city. And I found an article about Victoria's annual charity gala. There was a photo of her looking so beautiful, so successful. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter with love and sadness. And the article talked about how Victoria Wright-Sterling, philanthropist and advocate for the homeless, was the granddaughter of the late Eleanor Wright, whose experience with family tragedy inspired her charitable work. Victoria's face flushed. I've always said that losing you when I was 12 inspired my work. That watching my father grieve made me want to help others who'd lost family members. I've told that story in a dozen interviews. I know, Eleanor said gently, and I realized I'd done you a disservice. My silence, my sacrifice had created a lie you've been living your whole adult life. You've built your identity, your purpose on a tragedy that wasn't real. You've raised money in my name in memory of a grandmother who didn't die. But my charity work is real, Victoria protested. The good I do is real. Of course it is, Eleanor agreed, but it's based on a fiction, and I realized that wasn't fair to you or to the homeless people you help. Because Victoria, you raise money for people like me, but you didn't really understand what our lives are like. You thought you did because of your family's tragedy, but you didn't truly know. Eleanor reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. I came back because I wanted you to see. I wanted you to meet a homeless grandmother, your homeless grandmother, and understand that we're not statistics or charity cases. We're real people with real stories, people who once had homes and families and lives before things went wrong. I do understand, Victoria said defensively. I've worked with homeless organizations for 15 years. You work with organizations, Eleanor said. But have you ever sat down with an actual homeless person and heard their story? Have you ever asked them about their lives before they lost everything? Or do you just write checks and organize galas? The words stung because they were true. Victoria realized she'd spent years raising money for the homeless without really knowing any homeless individuals. They'd been a cause, a worthy charity, but not real people to her, not people like her grandmother. I also came back, Eleanor continued, because I'm dying. I have congestive heart failure. The doctors at the free clinic told me I probably have less than a year, and I realized I didn't want to die alone on the street with no one knowing my real name, with my family thinking I'd been dead for 3 decades. Thomas made a choked sound. Mom, no, you're going to be fine. We'll get you the best doctors, the best treatment. It's too late for that, Eleanor said calmly. But it's not too late for me to see my family one more time, to tell you I love you, and to make sure the truth is known. I want Victoria to use my story, my real story, in her charitable work. Tell people about the grandmother who was abused, who ran away, who tried to rebuild her life but ended up homeless. Tell them that any of us is just a few bad breaks away from losing everything. Victoria was sobbing now, her perfect makeup ruined, her composure shattered. Grandma, I'm so sorry you went through this alone. I'm sorry we didn't know, didn't help. I'm sorry for everything. Eleanor stood up slowly and moved around the table. She pulled Victoria into her arms the way she used to when Victoria was a little girl, letting her granddaughter cry against her shoulder. "SHH, sweetheart," Eleanor murmured. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault, but now you know, and now you can do something about it." They stayed like that for several minutes, grandmother and granddaughter, bridging 30 years of separation with a single embrace. Finally, Victoria pulled back, wiping her eyes. "What do you want me to do?" "Come with me," Eleanor said. "Come spend time with me, not as a charity worker and a homeless person, but as my granddaughter and me as your grandmother. Let me show you where I've been living, introduce you to the other people on the streets. Hear their stories. Really understand what you're trying to help. And then," Eleanor continued, "use your voice, your influence, your resources to make a real difference, not just raising money for shelters, but changing the systems that create homelessness. Fighting for affordable housing, better mental health care, protection for domestic violence victims, health care that doesn't bankrupt people." Victoria nodded, her mind racing. "I will. I promise I will." Thomas had been sitting quietly, tears running down his face. Now he spoke, Mom, you're not living on the street for even one more night. You're coming home with me. You'll stay with us for as long as you need, as long as you want. Tommy, Eleanor began. I won't hear any arguments, Thomas said firmly. I've lost 30 years with you already. I'm not losing one more day. You're my mother. You're coming home. Barbara, who had been silent this whole time, spoke up. Eleanor, we'd be honored to have you stay with us. Your family. You should be with family. Eleanor looked around at their faces, her son, her daughter-in-law, her granddaughter, her grandson-in-law, all looking at her with love, with concern, with welcome. After 5 years of being invisible, of being avoided, of being one of society's forgotten people, she was being seen, really seen. All right, she said softly. I'll come home. The next few hours were a blur. Victoria returned to the gala long enough to make a brief announcement that due to a family emergency, she needed to leave, but the event would continue. She didn't explain further, ignoring the whispers and curious looks. Thomas and Barbara took Eleanor back to their home in Evanston, a beautiful Victorian house with a guest room that had been Victoria's childhood bedroom. They helped Eleanor shower, gave her clean clothes, Barbara's clothes that were much too big but infinitely better than what Eleanor had been wearing. They fed her a proper meal, her first in days. Victoria and Robert went home briefly, but Victoria couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., she got up and drove to her father's house. She found Eleanor awake, too, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, looking out at the dark yard. Can't sleep? Eleanor asked as Victoria sat down beside her. Too much to process, Victoria admitted. Grandma, I keep thinking about all those years, all the times I walked past homeless people and didn't really see them, all the galas and fundraisers where I gave speeches about my tragic family history. I feel like such a fraud. You're not a fraud, Eleanor said firmly. The work you've done is real and good. You've helped many people, raised a lot of money for important causes. Don't diminish that. But I didn't really understand, Victoria said. I thought I did, but I didn't. Now you do, Eleanor said. Or at least you're beginning to, and that's what matters, what you do next. Will you tell me? Victoria asked. Will you tell me about the last 5 years, about what it was really like? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Yes, but not all tonight. Some stories need time and daylight. But I'll tell you this, the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold or the danger, though all of those were terrible. The hardest part was the invisibility. People looked right through me. To them, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a problem, a nuisance, something to avoid. I'm ashamed to say I probably did that, Victoria admitted. Looked away, walked past, avoided making eye contact. Most people do, Eleanor said. It's uncomfortable to see suffering, easier to pretend it's not there. But every homeless person you see has a story, a life they lived before they ended up on the streets. We were teachers and nurses and accountants and veterans. We had families and dreams. And then something went wrong: illness, job loss, divorce, addiction, mental health crisis, domestic violence. For me, it was several things at once, but it could happen to anyone. I want to hear all the stories, Victoria said. Yours and others, I want to really understand. Eleanor smiled. Then we'll start tomorrow. There's a shelter I stayed at sometimes in downtown Chicago. We'll go there. I'll introduce you to some people I know. You'll hear their stories. And that's exactly what they did. The next day, Victoria Wright-Sterling, socialite and philanthropist, walked into a homeless shelter for the first time, not as a board member or a donor, but as Eleanor's granddaughter. She sat in the common room and listened as Eleanor introduced her to Maria, who'd been a high school teacher before schizophrenia destroyed her career and her family rejected her. She met Robert, a Vietnam veteran with PTSD who'd been living on the streets for 20 years. She met Sarah, a young woman who'd fled an abusive relationship with her 2 children and ended up in the shelter system. Victoria listened to their stories, really listened, and began to understand what her grandmother had been trying to tell her. These weren't abstract charity cases. These were real people with complex lives, people who'd fallen through the cracks of a society that didn't have adequate safety nets. Over the next few weeks, as Eleanor settled into her son's home and began medical treatment for her heart condition, Victoria transformed her charitable approach. She didn't cancel her annual gala. In fact, the next year's event was even bigger. But she changed how she talked about it, changed what she emphasized, changed where the money went. At the gala the following year, Victoria stood at the podium, her grandmother Eleanor beside her in a beautiful dress, healthy and cared for, looking 20 years younger than she had that night at the Arts Center. Last year, Victoria told the assembled crowd, I told you all that I'd lost my grandmother Eleanor when I was 12 and that her death inspired my charitable work. That was a lie. Not intentionally, but a lie nonetheless. My grandmother didn't die 30 years ago. She was alive, and for the last 5 years she was homeless. The room fell silent. Cameras flashed. People leaned forward in their seats. "I'm going to let her tell you her story," Victoria said. "Because if we're going to truly help the homeless, we need to stop seeing them as the homeless and start seeing them as individuals with names and histories and dignity. We need to understand that homelessness can happen to anyone, even your grandmother." Eleanor stepped forward and began to speak. She told them about her marriage, the abuse, her escape. She told them about rebuilding her life in Seattle, getting cancer, losing everything. She told them about living on the streets, about the cold and fear and hunger, but most of all about the invisibility, the feeling of being erased from society. "When my granddaughter raised money for homeless veterans, for homeless families, she thought she understood," Eleanor said. "But she didn't, not really. None of us can truly understand unless we've been there, but we can listen, we can see. We can acknowledge that homeless people are people, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, someone's child, someone's parent." She paused, looking out at the wealthy crowd. "I know many of you have walked past homeless people without really seeing them. I don't blame you, it's what we're trained to do, to look away from suffering. But I'm asking you tonight to start looking, to start seeing, to start listening. Because until you do, no amount of money you raise will truly solve the problem. The solution starts with recognition, with dignity, with understanding that any of us could be in that position." The room erupted in applause. People stood. Many were crying, and Victoria stood beside her grandmother, proud and humbled and determined to do better. In the months that followed, Victoria did do better. She partnered with homeless advocacy groups, not just as a donor, but as a learner and a collaborator. She hired formerly homeless individuals to work in her foundation. She lobbied for affordable housing legislation, for better mental health services, for stronger domestic violence protections. But more than any of that, she spent time with her grandmother. They had breakfast together every Sunday. Eleanor told Victoria stories about her life, about Henry before the war damaged him, about young Tommy learning to ride a bicycle, about the dreams she'd had as a young woman. Victoria absorbed it all, making up for 30 lost years. Thomas, too, made up for lost time. He and Eleanor took walks together, went to museums, watched old movies Eleanor remembered from the 1950s. They talked about Henry, about the good parts and the bad, about forgiveness and understanding. Thomas told his mother about his life, his career, his struggles, his triumphs. They laughed together and cried together and healed together. Eleanor's health improved with proper medical care, good food, and love. The doctors were surprised. They'd given her less than a year, but she defied their predictions. She lived for 3 more years, years filled with family and purpose and joy. During those 3 years, Eleanor became something of a public figure. She spoke at events, at schools, at churches, telling her story. She advocated for the homeless, lending her voice and her very personal experience to the cause. She helped Victoria transform her foundation from a well-meaning charity into a powerful force for systemic change. And perhaps most importantly, she helped Victoria and countless others understand that the line between us and them is thinner than we think. That the homeless woman on the corner could be someone's grandmother. That the man sleeping under the bridge could be someone's father. That every person has a story, and every story deserves to be heard. When Eleanor finally passed away in her sleep at age 81, surrounded by family in a warm home, her obituary told the truth. It described her as Eleanor Wright, survivor of domestic violence, cancer survivor, advocate for the homeless, beloved mother and grandmother. Hundreds of people came to her funeral, not just family and society friends, but people from shelters and soup kitchens, people whose lives she'd touched in those last 3 years. Victoria gave the eulogy, standing at the same podium where her grandmother had spoken at that gala 3 years earlier. "My grandmother taught me the most important lesson of my life," Victoria said, looking out at the crowd. "She taught me to see, not just look, but truly see, to recognize the humanity in every person, regardless of their circumstances, to understand that we're all connected, that we're all vulnerable, that we're all deserving of dignity and compassion. She also taught me," Victoria continued, her voice breaking slightly, "that it's never too late for truth, that secrets, even secrets kept to protect others, can be more harmful than the truth. That family means showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Victoria paused, composing herself. "In our last conversation, my grandmother told me she didn't regret the years on the street, as terrible as they were. She said those years taught her something she needed to learn, that possessions and status and reputation don't make us who we are, that we can lose everything and still be ourselves. That dignity comes from within, not from external circumstances. She said those years made her appreciate small things, a warm bed, a hot meal, a kind word. And she said those years gave her a story worth telling, a truth worth sharing, a lesson worth teaching. Thomas sat in the front row, holding Barbara's hand, tears streaming down his face. Next to him sat Victoria's children, Eleanor's great-grandchildren, who'd had the blessing of knowing their great-grandmother for 3 precious years. After the funeral, Victoria stood at the reception, greeting the long line of people who'd come to pay respects. A woman approached her, middle-aged, hesitant. "Mrs. Sterling, you don't know me," the woman said, "but I wanted to thank you and thank your grandmother. I heard her speak at a shelter 2 years ago. I was living there with my kids after leaving an abusive marriage. I felt so ashamed, so worthless, but your grandmother told me her story and she said something that changed my life." "What did she say?" Victoria asked gently. "She said, you're not homeless, you're between homes, you're not helpless, you're rebuilding, you're not worthless, you're priceless." She said it to all of us that day, but she looked right at me when she said it, and I believed her. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I have an apartment now, a job, my kids are in school, we're going to be okay, and it started that day when your grandmother helped me see myself differently." Victoria hugged the woman. "Thank you for telling me this. My grandmother would be so happy to know her words made a difference." "They made all the difference," the woman said. As the sun set that evening, Victoria stood alone at her grandmother's grave. Headstone read, Eleanor Wright, 1947-028, beloved mother, grandmother, advocate, truth-teller, she taught us to see. "You did make a difference, Grandma," Victoria whispered. "You changed me. You changed so many people. I promise I'll keep telling your story. I'll keep fighting for the invisible people. I'll keep seeing." And she did. Victoria spent the rest of her life advocating for the homeless, but with a depth of understanding and authenticity she'd never had before. She told Eleanor's story hundreds of times, using it to illustrate the complex realities of homelessness, the importance of domestic violence protections, the need for compassionate health care, the critical value of family and community. She established the Eleanor Wright Foundation, focused not just on emergency services but on prevention, helping people before they became homeless, supporting domestic violence survivors, providing medical care assistance, creating affordable housing. The Foundation's motto, taken from Eleanor's words, was simple: see, listen, act. Thomas, in his final years, often spoke about his mother at events. He talked openly about his father's violence, about the decision to fake Eleanor's death, about the regret he carried for 30 years. He became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, speaking particularly to men about recognizing abuse and intervening. "My mother protected me," he would say. "She sacrificed her whole life to protect my reputation, my career, my comfort. That was wrong. I should have protected her. All of us sons, daughters, friends, neighbors, we need to protect the victims, not the reputations of abusers." The ripple effects of Eleanor's decision to reveal herself that night at the gala continued for years. The story was covered by national news, written about in magazines, discussed in social work programs and domestic violence prevention courses. Eleanor's story, as it came to be known, became a teaching tool, a conversation starter, a catalyst for change. But perhaps the most important impact was the simplest one. Eleanor's story helped people see the homeless differently. When they encountered someone living on the street, many people thought of Eleanor, grandmother, survivor, real person with a real story. They stopped looking away. They started seeing. And that, Eleanor would have said, was exactly what she'd hoped for. Years after Eleanor's death, Victoria's daughter Sarah, Eleanor's great-granddaughter, became a documentary filmmaker. Her first major film was about her great-grandmother's life. She titled it Invisible No More, The Eleanor Wright Story. The film opened with the footage from that night at the Metropolitan Arts Center. Someone had recorded it on their phone, Victoria confronting the elderly homeless woman at the entrance. The video had gone viral at the time, but in the film it became something more powerful. The moment when one woman's decision to tell the truth changed countless lives. The documentary traced Eleanor's full story, from her youth in the 1950s through her marriage, the abuse, her escape, her years in Seattle, her descent into homelessness, and finally her decision to return to Chicago. It included interviews with people she'd helped, with domestic violence advocates, with homeless services providers, with family members. But the most powerful moments were Eleanor's own words, recorded during those last 3 years. Sarah had filmed hours of interviews with her great-grandmother, never knowing she was creating a historical document. In one clip, Eleanor sat in Thomas's sunny kitchen, a cup of tea in her weathered hands, speaking directly to the camera. "People ask me if I regret the 30 years of hiding," Eleanor said. "They want me to say yes, to say I should have come back sooner, should have been honest from the start, but I don't regret it. I did what I thought was right at the time, what I thought was necessary to protect my son. Was I wrong? Maybe, probably, but we all make decisions based on the information and circumstances we have in the moment. She paused, sipping her tea. What I do regret is that it took me hitting rock bottom, living on the streets, being truly invisible to understand something important. I spent 30 years hiding, protecting a reputation, maintaining a fiction. But truth is powerful, truth is liberating, and truth, even painful truth, is better than comfortable lies. Eleanor looked directly into the camera, her blue eyes clear and strong. If someone watching this is living a lie to protect someone else, to maintain an image, to avoid shame, please reconsider. Truth may be hard, but it's also healing. And secrets, they have a way of causing more damage than the truth ever could. The documentary ended with Eleanor's funeral, with Victoria's eulogy, with that final shot of the gravestone. She taught us to see. When the film premiered, it won awards and sparked conversations across the country. But more importantly, it continued Eleanor's work. Viewers who watched it said they'd never look at homeless individuals the same way. They said they understood now that homelessness wasn't about moral failure or laziness, but about a complex web of circumstances, bad luck, and inadequate social support systems. Some viewers said the film inspired them to volunteer at shelters, to donate to homeless services, to advocate for policy changes. Others said it prompted difficult conversations about family secrets, about domestic violence, about the lies we tell to protect people who maybe don't deserve protection. And many viewers said it taught them to really see the invisible people in their communities. On what would have been Eleanor's 85th birthday, Victoria stood before a crowd at the dedication of the Eleanor Wright Housing Complex, a new affordable housing development funded by her foundation. The building was beautiful, modern, with 200 units for low-income families and individuals transitioning out of homelessness. My grandmother lived on the streets because she didn't have access to affordable housing, Victoria said at the ceremony. She died in a comfortable home, surrounded by love because she had family who could take her in. But not everyone has that. This building represents a simple truth my grandmother taught me. Housing is a human right, not a privilege. Everyone deserves a safe place to live. As Victoria cut the ribbon, she thought about that night 5 years ago when her perfectly planned gala had been disrupted by an elderly homeless woman claiming to be her grandmother. She thought about how she'd almost had Eleanor removed, almost missed the opportunity to know her, almost let security escort away the most important person in her life. She thought about all the times she'd walked past homeless people without really seeing them, without wondering about their stories. And she thought about how one woman's courage to tell the truth had changed everything, not just for Victoria, not just for Thomas, but for countless others. The ribbon fell away, and the first residents began moving into their new apartments. Among them was Maria, the former teacher with schizophrenia whom Victoria had met that first day at the shelter. Maria was one of the first people Eleanor had introduced Victoria to, one of the first to help Victoria truly understand. Maria hugged Victoria, tears running down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for your grandmother. Thank you for this chance." "Thank my grandmother," Victoria said. "She's the one who taught me to see." That evening, Victoria visited Eleanor's grave, as she did every week. She brought fresh flowers, sat on the grass beside the headstone, and told Eleanor about the housing complex opening, about Maria moving in, about all the good things happening because of Eleanor's story. "I miss you, Grandma," Victoria said softly. "Every day I miss you, but I'm so grateful we had those 3 years. I'm grateful you came back. I'm grateful you told the truth." The sun was setting, casting golden light across the cemetery. Birds sang in nearby trees. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was peaceful, beautiful. "You taught me to see," Victoria continued. "But you taught me more than that. You taught me that it's never too late to tell the truth, that it's never too late to come home. That family, real family, sees past the surface to the person underneath. That dignity isn't about what you own or where you live, but about who you are and how you treat others." Victoria stood, kissed her fingertips, and pressed them to Eleanor's name carved in stone. "I love you, Grandma. And I promise I'll keep seeing, I'll keep telling your story, I'll keep fighting for the invisible people. That's your legacy, that's the gift you gave us." As Victoria walked back to her car, she passed an elderly man sitting on a bench near the cemetery entrance. He was shabbily dressed, a torn backpack beside him. In the past, Victoria would have looked away, would have hurried past. But now she stopped. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the dignity in his weathered face, the intelligence in his eyes, the person underneath the circumstances. "Excuse me," Victoria said. "Are you all right? Is there anything you need?" The man looked up, surprise flickering across his face, surprise at being seen, at being spoken to as a person. "I'm okay," he said. "Just resting. Nice evening." "It is," Victoria agreed. "I'm Victoria. What's your name?" "George," the man said, a small smile appearing. "Nice to meet you, Victoria." They talked for a few minutes. George told her he'd been a carpenter, showed her his calloused hands. He'd lost his job during the 2008 recession, had never quite recovered. His wife had died, his kids were scattered across the country. He'd been on the streets for 3 years. Victoria listened to his story, acknowledging his humanity, his dignity, his worth. When they parted, she gave George information about the Eleanor Wright housing complex, about services available, about resources that could help. But more importantly, she saw him. She recognized him as a person, not a problem. As someone's father, someone's husband, someone's friend, as George. That was Eleanor's legacy, not the housing complex, not the foundation, not the awards or recognition. Eleanor's legacy was teaching people to see, to look at the invisible people and acknowledge their humanity, to listen to their stories, to recognize that any of us could be them, that they are us, that we're all connected in our vulnerability and our strength. As Victoria drove home that night past the gleaming buildings and busy streets of Chicago, she noticed things she'd once overlooked. The woman sleeping in a doorway, the man pushing a shopping cart full of belongings, the teenager with a cardboard sign. She saw them all, and she knew Eleanor would be proud. Thank you for listening to this story. If Eleanor's journey touched your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these remind us of our shared humanity and the power of seeing one another truly. Your support helps us continue sharing these important narratives that change how we view the world and each other.